Jimmy thought this was hilarious. He couldn't stop laughing. His dad said Mom would get so mad at Joe because he would go in the refrigerator then begin to eat a 5-pound block of butter all at one time. Jimmy said, that would make me sick. He said. Not Joe, he loved butter for some reason. Maybe he loved the taste of it or liked the color yellow. Nobody ever really figured that one out. He continued, one day my dad and Joe were out in the yard. Dad had a bitch dog in heat. Well, there came a dog from somewhere. So Dad got his shotgun and shot it in the air just enough to scare the dog off. Well, old Joe saw him do that, so the next time that dog came back, old Joe jumped on his back backwards like he was riding a horse. He was shoving a corn cob up the dog's butt and the dog went down the road yelping all the way. Jimmy was laughing so hard till his gut hurt and his dad went on to say the dog tried to get away but he couldn't because Joe had his tail wrapped around his neck. Dad said, guaranteed the dog didn't ever come back. As they got closer to Bill's dad's house, he noticed there were a lot of cars in the driveway. It was Ken and Butch, they were his older brothers. He pulled in and got out of the car, walked into the house. Jimmy saw a lot of people he didn't know as he felt fear like a thunderbolt come over him. He just stood there and watched them. Some of them had cans of beer in their hands and he thought they acted like they were drunk. One of the men was holding a gun and telling the other what kind it was. He said, it's a .22 rifle and it holds 18 bullets too. It's really nice, one of the other men said. Bill had walked in the other room to talk to his father. Jimmy didn't say anything, he just stood there looking at the gun and Bill's brother Ken said, can I shoot it? The man spoke up, sure, as the bunch of them went outside to the backyard. So Jimmy thought to himself he wanted to see them shoot it. He never saw anyone shoot a gun before except his grandmother's dad shooting at them or just on TV. So as he followed them out back he saw a stump and so he sat down on it to watch. The men were setting up cans on a fence in the back so they could shoot them off. As they took turns, they passed the gun back and forth to each other. Ken never missed. When it was his turn to shoot again, the man went to hand Ken the gun and then suddenly he snatched it back with a pissed off look on his face as he pointed it at Ken. He said, I guess I can't hit a Ken, but I bet I can hit you. As he pulled the trigger and little Jimmy saw Ken fall to the ground with blood on his chest. Little Jimmy was gripped with fear as he thought that man was going to shoot all of them. He couldn't sit still any longer so he jumped up and ran back in the house. Soon as he got through the door he saw his dad and told him what just happened. His eyes widened with surprise. Bill yelled to his mom and dad to call an ambulance and the police. Johnny just shot Ken in the chest. Jimmy looked out the window to see what was going on. To his amazement, the whole bunch of them had tackled the man with the gun and held him down to the ground until the police got there, while Bill's mom was trying to look after Ken as he lay there. His white shirt was almost all red now from the blood. There was so much blood it was starting to gather in a puddle. She kept saying, hold on Ken, the ambulance is on the way. Ken took his last breath and his mother passed out on the ground from shock. All of a sudden cops were everywhere. They arrested Johnny and put him in a police car. Ken was pronounced dead on the scene. Bill and his dad rushed to the hospital to see his mom because she had passed out from the shock of Ken dying in her arms. A little bit later, after making sure his mom was okay, Bill decided to take Jimmy back to Mrs. Hatter's house. So he took Jimmy to the car and they got in. His dad didn't say a word about what had happened. When they pulled into Helen's driveway, Bill pulled to a stop and said, get out, I have to go. So Jimmy did as he was asked. Then he stood there and watched his dad pull out as he sped down the road. Jimmy couldn't hold it back anymore, he was terrified at what he had seen. His body was shaking with fear as the tears rolled down his face. He couldn't understand why that guy had shot his uncle, or why everyone was so mean to him, or why no one loved him. He thought everybody in the whole world hated him. He didn't see Helen and figured she must be in the chicken house working. So he walked in the house, he didn't see anyone, so he went upstairs and opened the attic door. It was dark and smelled musty. He bent down, got in and sat on the floor, then pulled the door shut behind him. That's where he would stay for almost 2 days before he got up the nerve to come out, and he almost lost his nerve then. One day Kenny and Michelle had ice cream and Jimmy tried to get some. Well, next thing you know, Kenny hit little Jimmy with a big spoon on the top of his head. All of a sudden the blood was running down his face and head. It was getting everywhere. Helen heard crying and came to see what the problem was. Little Jimmy was terrified and crying. Helen took a washcloth and tried to stop the bleeding, but she couldn't, so she took him to the emergency room. The doctor came in and had a look at his head and said, "He's going to need about 5 stitches to close up the cut." Jimmy was still crying. He was scared to death as the doctor said, "Calm down, son, you're going to be okay." It didn't really help Jimmy calm down at all. He was still scared to death. As the doctor came towards him, he started running around the bed that was in the room to try and get away. Helen grabbed him by his arm as he tried to get past her, and she held him down for the doctor. He started to put the stitches in Jimmy's head. He cried out loud when the needle poked him over and over. As the doctor got finished, he then put a big bandage on Jimmy's head and said, "Okay, son, you're all done." As Helen walked out with him and did a quick scan of the parking lot to find her car, she said, "There it is over there," as they walked over to it and got in. She pulled out and headed back to the house. When they got back to the house, Helen grabbed him by his hair and dragged him in the house. She was mad as hell at him because he made the doctor chase him around the bed. Jimmy let out a wail and screamed all the way. A few weeks later, Jimmy was walking home from school. It was sunny too, not a cloud in the sky. A car pulled alongside him and stopped. The man asked him to come to his window. He said, "How are you?" with a smirk on his face as Jimmy walked up to the car. "Okay," he replied. He saw a big collie that looked just like Lassie in a back seat. He asked, "Would you like to have a dog?" Jimmy's eyes brightened up with anticipation and he smiled. All he ever wanted was a family and to be loved, but he knew that would never happen. He would grow up without parents, often trying not to get close to other people, in fear that the person will end up hurting or abandoning him. It's often going to be hard for him to show love or affection because he will never be shown love or affection himself. At least the dog would be his friend, or at least he hoped so anyway. One friend would be better than none. The man said, "I have to get rid of him because I'm not allowed to have pets at my new place, and I want to make sure he has a good home." Jimmy replied, "Sure, I'll take good care of him." So the man said, "Are you sure?" And he opened his door and hooked a leash to his dog Champ. He led him around to the other side of the car to Jimmy. As he took the lead from the man, Jimmy said to him, "He will be my best friend. Thank you, sir." He turned towards his house and walked his dog proudly down the street. He was so excited that he couldn't help but to smile. For once he felt happy in his life. When he got closer to his house, fear set in because he didn't know what Helen would say. As he walked up the driveway, Kenny saw him and ran up to Jimmy. "Where did you get the dog?" he asked. Jimmy told him about the man as they both were petting the dog. As Helen came out the door, she saw them with the dog and in a furious voice said, "You're not keeping the dog." She told him to bring Champ back to where he got him. They lived on a big farm, so Jimmy didn't understand why he couldn't keep him. Knowing he couldn't bring him back, Jimmy didn't even know the man's name or where he lived. The next day Jimmy was playing and heard a gunshot right outside, so he ran out to see what was going on, and then he saw his great-grandfather with his shotgun by the barn door. Jimmy asked him, "What did you shoot?" And he replied, "I shot a rat." He just had a bad feeling that he was lying to him. At that time Jimmy looked down on the ground and there was a trail of blood. Then as he looked up, his pop pointed the gun at him and said he was going to shoot him too. As Jimmy ran back across the yard, he heard shots ring out again. His heart was racing and he could see the dirt fly up right beside him. That was too close. In the house, he ran as fast as he could. Then he ran right into Helen with such force he about knocked her in the floor. Jimmy told Helen what Plop had said and she just acted like she didn't even care if he did shoot him. A little later on that day Jimmy was outside, his dog was limping, and he ran over to him. Then he saw blood on his back leg, where his Plop had shot him, and he could see where the lead pellets hit his dog. So he ran to get Helen, and told her what Plop had done. He told her that Plop told him that he shot a rat. Jimmy asked her how he could think his dog was a rat. He was way too big to be a rat. Helen said he's drunk and just went off. She took Jimmy's dog to the dog pound the very next day, and Jimmy never saw him again. When she came back home and noticed Jimmy was on the swing they had made on one of the limbs of the old oak tree. As Helen got out of her car, she called for him. He didn't know what she wanted as fear came over him as always. Jimmy saw her going to the back of her car and wondered what she had. She spoke up and said, "Your mom bought you a bike." He said, "For me, really?" As he grabbed onto the handlebars and gave it a quick look over. Then he climbed on his bike and began to ride around the driveway. It went around the house like a racetrack, as this went on for a while till Jimmy got bored with that. Then that's when he decided to ride down the road, so that's what he did. By now he was about a block away from the house and he was having the time of his life. He just kept weaving back and forth across the road. When out of nowhere there was a big bang. The next thing he knew, he was airborne and flying through the air like Superman. It all happened so fast he didn't even realize what had happened to him. As a lady ran up to him with tears rolling down her face asking him if he was okay over and over in a panic. As he picked himself up off the road, he realized he wasn't dead or hurt, not even a scratch. He spoke up and asked her, "Please don't tell my mom, she will take the bike away from me." She picked it up and pushed it back to the house. She just stood there watching with amazement as he went down the road. She couldn't understand how he didn't get hurt, as she thought to herself, "I bet I was doing 35 or 50 miles per hour. As she stood there for a bit because she was still shook up from it all. Jimmy just wanted to get his bike home before Helen saw him. When he had his bike in back by the barn, he took a pair of pliers and fixed his chain guard as best as he could. He sure hoped no one noticed it. On the weekends, Jimmy's mom would bring his half-brother and sister to stay at Mom's so they could stay drunk at the bar. His mom had bought them bow and arrows to play with, although she should have known that they were too young to have things like that without supervision. Even though Helen was there, she was working out in the chicken house most of the time, so really they were on their own, you might as well say. Kenny, Lisa, and Michelle were outside with Jimmy and James, who was Jimmy's half-brother, but Helen called him Stinky. Anyway, Stinky came out there with them. Jimmy and Kenny had made a target out of cardboard. Then they had taken the rubber plungers off the arrows and sharpened them with a pencil sharpener. They took turns shooting the target. Stinky was fighting with Michelle, and he took her little red wagon. Jimmy told Stinky to give it back to her, he would shoot him, but he didn't listen. As Jimmy drew back the bow, he had it pointed right at his face. Jimmy told him to give back her wagon or he would shoot him, and that moment the arrow slipped out of Jimmy's hand. It had flown out of the bow right into Stinky's right eye. Helen called Jimmy's mom and told her what happened. When they got there, she grabbed Stinky and rushed him to the hospital with the arrow in his eye. While he was at the hospital, the doctor told Alice that if the arrow had gone any further, it would have went in his brain and killed him. Tommy almost beat Jimmy to death. He was going to kill him if he didn't stop. His face was all bloody, and both of his eyes were swollen shut. All little Jimmy could see was a blur. Tommy would never forgive him for what had happened. Though it was really an accident. Jimmy never meant for it to really happen. He just wanted them to stop fighting over the wagon. He wouldn't ever live this down for the rest of his life. From then on, every weekend, Tommy would come and beat the hell out of little Jimmy. A few days later, there were bad lightning storms. All of a sudden, Helen yelled in a mean voice for Jimmy come to her right then. Jimmy just knew she was going to beat him with a belt or pull hands full of his hair out by the roots, or worse. It hurt so badly. Jimmy let out a scream as she beat him with a buckle and gave him huge bruises all up and down his back and legs just because he was trying to make a bologna sandwich. Little Jimmy tried to get away as she threw him back in a chair and pulled more hands full of his hair out. He used his feet to try and hold her off of him so she couldn't reach his hair. By this time, the storms were really bad. Lightning struck, then the lights went out, and little Jimmy was paralyzed with fear. He pulled his body into a ball. He was scared to death. Helen spoke up and said, "Go to the bathroom and get a bar of soap." So he limped to the bathroom. He pulled out a drawer, then got out a bar of soap and went back down the hall. She yelled at him, calling him a little bastard. She said, "Get your clothes off right now." So Jimmy undressed. He stood there naked then. Helen hit him again with the belt and told him to go outside. Jimmy hesitated, scared to move. So Helen smacked him across the face with such force it knocked him to the floor. As she started towards him, he tried to pick himself up, scared, and went out into the storm. There was really bad lightning, Jimmy limped down the steps, and he stood there in the pouring rain. He was terrified too. There was a loud crack of thunder and he jumped. He had no one that cared about him. As the rain beat down on Jimmy so hard, she hadn't even gave him a towel to dry with. He hurt so badly from the beatings and the rain. It felt like bullets on his bruises and the rain was so cold. As he tried to take in a breath, that's when the pain hit him. It made his body jerk. He could barely catch his breath as he winced and cried out in pain. Then a bright streak of lightning came really close to Jimmy, and he thought to himself he wished it hit him so the pain would be over with, but he wasn't that lucky. He thought he was dead for a second as the lightning flashed all across the sky and the thunder made the ground shake under his feet. He jumped again as he tried to rub the bar of soap on his chest. He was in so much pain. He had to have had at least 3 or 4 crack ribs. Jimmy did his best to wash in the storm, even though he was terrified. Helen was so mean to him that she wouldn't even let him wash in the house. When it snowed, she would make him go outside. Either way, he couldn't win. A few days later, Kenny stole some money out of Helen's purse. Then Helen blamed it on Jimmy. When she wasn't working, she was always drunk, even from beer or Jack Daniels. She decided to call Jimmy's mom Alice and tell her that Jimmy stole money from her. Helen explained to Alice, and she told her that Jimmy kicked her in the stomach, which was a lie. You could almost say Alice lived in a bar with her new boyfriend. They stayed drunk all the time. So, Alice told her she was on her way with Tommy, and she would kill him as they headed for the car. They lived in Salisbury. As Tommy got behind the wheel saying, "That little bastard, I'm going to break his neck," they sped out of the driveway and down the street. He headed for the highway, which was the new Route 50. Tommy mashed the gas even harder than ever. You could hear the motor roar. As he opened another beer, he asked Alice if she wanted another. They both were already drunk. When they arrived, Jimmy was standing in the yard. As they pulled in the driveway, Tommy slammed the car in park before he even got the car stopped and jumped out. Alice went in the house to talk to her mom. Tommy ran up to Jimmy and punched him in the face with such force it knocked him on the ground and busted his mouth and nose. The blood was pouring from his face. Little Jimmy screamed, hoping someone would hear him, but no one came to help him. Tommy kicked him multiple times in the face and ribs as he screamed at him to get up. He couldn't get up even if he wanted to because he couldn't even breathe. Jimmy put his arms around his head trying to keep from getting kicked in the face. By this time, Jimmy was screaming and Kenny just stood there at the edge of the yard watching him kick the shit out of Jimmy. Kenny was a bad kid and he would steal stuff. Then the blame would end up on Jimmy.